So today we're going to go live and we're going to talk about the ether. I think this is going to be an interesting one. And today we're going to show some books, which I always talk about old books, books before the 1920s that talked about the ether. We're doing a little presentation today, going through the ether, going through electroculture, going through EMFs and ancient history. That's what we're going to go through today. So I got a little slideshow today for you guys to see. So what we're going to do, let me just pop on in here and we're going to kind of go through some stuff. And this is my first time doing a official YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, whatever video you want to call it. So we're going to try this out today. But I put together a whole bunch of different pictures that we're going to go through and talk about because I think this is important, especially on the topic of the ether. Now, remember, the ether was removed off the periodic table after 1908 and 1909. So this is Dmitri who discovered the ether, and he also discovered all these other elements which are just not taught about. So when we think of why we haven't learned about the ether, it's because it's been removed. What's also interesting is that the periodic table still rewards Dmitri for the periodic table every 10 years when they talk about it, how it's the most beautiful discovery ever and that we should be talking about it, but yet all of his work was removed off of it. So this is why when you start talking about the ether, a lot of people will say there's no such thing. Well, that's because it was removed. Then you have old books from before 1920s, which talk about the ether as well. And a lot of these books just aren't talked about anymore because of the Rockefeller takeover of the schools with the Rothschilds and the Morgans of controlling the school system. So when we move forward, we move into talking about Tesla. Check this out. 1896, Nikola Tesla, amazing plan to harness free currents, free energy. That's what it is. And we haven't been taught about this because it competes. JP Morgan didn't want to fund Tesla anymore because when you think about it, if you're using the Earth's energy, well, now all of a sudden that competes with charging somebody, which is fascinating. Then we move to the Rockefellers, and this is where I like to show about the education system being taken over. Right here, the beginning with the elder John D. Rockefeller in 1903, he establishes the General Education Board to handle his educational philanthropy. They always say that. It's always philanthropy. They're always helping out with that. But Rockefellers, JP Morgan, and Rothschilds own the education system. So this is why we're not taught about these things. Then you go back into these old books and you see the word ether. And look at how it's spelled. The A and the E is always connected. So that's what makes it challenging to find. Now, I was going through, this is the lexicon of the 1870s. There was a German fellow who created a book called The Builder Atlas. And he went through all of these things and showed everything, almost like the blueprint of humanity. That would be the best way to say this. But check this picture out. If you see right here, these are the antennas. These are what tap into the ether. And this type of design and building, all of the resonance and the materials all combining together all tap into the beautiful energy that's all around us known as the ether. And when we look at these old cathedrals and these buildings that we're going to go through today, you see they look like antennas. And it's interesting because if they were afraid of lightning, why would they be covering all the buildings with antennas? You have to think about that whole thing with the lightning rods and weather vanes and what we were sold. So then we move on to here. Thought this was a really interesting picture. This is a cathedral with a clock. Now, this makes me wonder if at a certain time these clocks would ring, and if there were bells up on top, those bells would ring at the same time. And then depending on the materials that are in this spire right here, if they begin to spin, then they can also create electricity. So this is interesting, but look at these designs. And that's why I said this guy's atlas was like the blueprint of humanity in all the buildings. He knew exactly what everything looked like. And this is 1878 when they were flying around in the air. So then we move to this. This I thought was really interesting. So this is an antenna. And look at, when we look at these temples, we never see this type of design anymore. Like that's all gone. And there's these really cool videos where you see these temples and they have the charge on top. They're tapping into the static charge, that's what they call it, but the charge that's up on top of them. And then here, right here, we see that again. And then this one doesn't have it, but it has the dragons, which is relating back to also, if you go instead of dinosaurs, you think dragons. So then we move to this one and we go to the next photo. This is, I thought, was really interesting. Cutting holes in stone in the mound builders that we've been told about. Look at this down here. This one, there's holes, almost like a little house. And this one is interesting too over here, but you look at all of this and go, wow, somebody understood how to move these gigantic stones and place them perfectly balanced. Look at this. Got a little rod right here, perfectly balanced them. So this is part of tapping into the realm and things that we just don't know. You know, nobody has a clue on a lot of things, on how things are built, the techniques, the technology, etc. And people are on horses over here, yet moving boulders like this. Then we move into this 1876 World Fair. Yeah, that was an interesting one. That was in Philadelphia. Look at these antennas again, tapping into the ether. And then look at this design. And these buildings are just remarkable. Each one is about 10 to 50 acres, which is mind blowing during the World Fair. So when they tell you it was all temporary, you have to ask yourself, how can that be temporary at that size? Then we move to this one. And I think this is a really good picture just so you guys can see. Now, this is to put a different perspective of the antennas. Now, the antennas on here look like crosses. You have the moon, and then you have these chains hanging, which I think are really interesting. These are also copper domes, which is fascinating. A lot of copper involved with it, which is very conductive. So then you think of a conductive material placed on top of this, and all of these working as antennas to pick up the energy that's all around us. And then you think of the materials that this building is made out of, and that would amplify it even more, like one big antenna or generator. But I thought the chains are interesting because you don't see these anymore. This is where things change. So what happens is an antenna like this will lose the chains, it'll then lose the cross, it'll lose the moon, and then it'll just be a straight rod. And that's usually the whole lightning rod or weather vane. I thought this was really interesting too. This is the old lamps or the old lights of the old world. And if you notice, they also have an antenna on top there. And then these used to light up, I believe, with static energy. If there was a charge that took place here, the gas, because they were gas lamps, which is funny, but the gas would then pop on and then you got light. It's interesting how all this technology existed in the 1870s, but we're not taught too much about it. Then you move to here. Here's another beautiful antenna with the spires. And you're looking at this again, tapping into that ether. And here you go. There's one right up on top as well. So this is just, these are just pictures to kind of just open up the mind and think about what you're looking at. And here's another one. Look at this. This looks like a spiral staircase that's going around this building and wrapping up to the top. So in a time in which you're attempting to survive and you have to be growing food, and let's say it's horse and wagon or horse and chariot, whatever it is, think of the detail and the time it would take to build something like this. This would be very challenging, especially if you were on the outside, weather permitting, things like that. And we also notice whited out sky, which I think we can talk about as well. Here's another one, stone and the antenna on top. And then look at the stone material. And this started to make me think about maybe some sort of event took place which turned all of this into stone. Something to kind of think about. Then we move into this. This is back to what I was talking about with that builder atlas. Look at this detail. And here's really cool. These look like, you think of like the coal plants or the steam plants as well too. This was already here because you're looking at this date and this is 1878. And then, so this is going even farther back than then. And you're starting to sit here and go, wow, this is already here too. And then look at this one on the right-hand side too. Looks just like those big, where the steam's popping up like New York City. So a lot of stuff has already been here. Then we move over here. Now we're in San Francisco, 1905 to 1910, when they were doing their World Fair that they were talking about. This is what it looked like. I mean, they just put together this little fountain, they threw together some sidewalk, and then just built these big, marvelous buildings all overnight. That's what we were told on that one. And then this is Coney Island, and they had some interesting ones there. They used to simulate weather events, destroying cities and rebuilding. And when we look at this building's no longer there. And it was due to a weather event known as a fire. The other thing that stands out really interesting is this blimp right here. They were flying around. Blimps actually go back to 1783. People in the air, 1783. This is a giant clock that worked with gas again and compressed air, and it just spun around and told people the time. And this was presented at the World Fair as well. Massive. Look at the people. Look at the size of this clock. I mean, also too, if you were having a temporary location or event or whatever, why would you build such a large thing? Questions. This is interesting. You go to the World Fair of 1893. Look at this. See that picture? And then you see Vegas. So you can see what they're trying to tell you, that's for sure. And it's being thrown in our faces. That all of these places were reset. A lot of this technology was gone. It was never presented to the people, but they decided to build something here to keep the people entertained. Thought this was an interesting one too. 1876 World Fair, Philadelphia again, and you see tracks. And you always see these mud roads in a lot of these pictures, mud floods. That's what people call it. But what I've started to notice when you think about tracks before the buildings are there, well, that would kind of make more sense. People were just walking on top of them. They threw some mud on top, kind of cover up the tracks. Don't want to show that electric vehicles, electric trains, electric trolleys already existed at a time in which you were rolling out that technology. Next, we go into here. We go to the Chicago World Fair temporary buildings, we were told. And this is just a great picture. This is with color. I try to get as many with color as possible so you can really kind of take it in. But they said that they just put all this up. They just put it together and threw it all up together. And then this is now we're over in Oregon, which is interesting. This is another one, Portland, Oregon. Here you go. These are all temporary buildings, as they're telling us. And there's big buildings back here. This one is wild. You have a bridge across the water to a castle, and then it goes back and forth. And it's interesting because when I was looking back at the population at the times in which this would be built, there were allegedly about 200,000 people, I believe they were saying. So, you know, you really have to think about the power that it would take to build all of us. And look at this. There's a blimp again. People flying around. So then we move forward and we're over here. This was, I thought, an interesting one. This is Tennessee World Fair. And what you notice is there's pyramids. And I noticed this in Chicago too. There were pyramids. There's all these Aztec ruins, they say, but those were already here because you see these same buildings already there in that city, in Tennessee, Chicago, all over the place, St. Louis. Here's another one. You're in Portland, Oregon, and just another one with color photos. This I thought was really interesting. Tennessee giant seesaw. Interesting. You start to think of the Ferris wheel, which weighed over, 500 tons at that time. Then you got to think about this. And then you have to think about transporting these things and bringing them places, because that's another part. They're talking about how this stuff is all transported. They set it up at the next World Fair. It didn't make any money, and they decided to just throw it up again. So things to kind of think about. This one I thought was really funny because here in Arizona, this is what they said the Arizona State Capitol building was going to be, but it was too useless to build. So they just still built a building out of travertine, but this was just over the top. But what's also interesting is this building was all not over the top. This was a school that was burned down in 1910, and you notice that's the same type of stone. That's the same thing. And you think back of Arizona, Arizona was fairly new at the time. So then you have to sit there and think, okay, it's fairly new, yet you're just throwing up these buildings. And then this I thought was really interesting. This is the Capitol building, and this is that same stone that I was just telling you guys about. And this is 1905. And this is a flood. And you notice there's no other buildings, which I think is really interesting. There's just these massive, massive buildings in the middle of pretty much nowhere that are just sitting around and people are inhabiting them. That's what I started to realize. That's what's going on. Now, when we get into EMFs, a lot of people, because we're going to kind of move into this and talk a little bit about this. So we have one part of energy. We have the ether and tapping into Mother Nature, grounding, all this beautiful stuff that's all about healing. Then we move to the other side, which is the dangerous stuff that they keep trying to sell people, smartwatches, AirPods, the whole thing, and that should be. So this is the Navy Medical Research Institute. This is a 1971 document that has over 5,000 studies on the dangers of EMF. So when they try to tell you it's safe, you got to kind of think about this. This goes into the side effects. These are some of the side effects: dizziness, hallucination, sleepiness, insomnia, chest pain. Then we move into a couple of these. If you have different things with the thyroid, these effects which are impacting the body. And then this one I thought was the most interesting because a lot of people always ask me about dental fillings. Well, sparking between dental fillings caused by cell phone signals. So if you do have a cell phone, or you do have the internet, or if you are using any of these things, you should hardwire it. Use an Ethernet cord, because it's really important to be aware of what you're being sold. If you have Wi-Fi and pinging frequencies and smartwatches and AirPods and all that pinging throughout the house, it's going to mess with your health. And when we go back to those old world buildings, those were healing. This stuff, not so much. Now, if we take it a step further about EMF, this is the difference between the rules and regulations. So when 2020 was happening and people were freaking out because of the loss of smell, loss of taste, dizziness, hair loss, that whole thing, well, look at what the regulation is down here. And then look at the regulation in this country and look at the regulation in this country. That is a major difference. So as they were rolling out that new technology, people started suffering from radio wave sickness. Now, the question is, why haven't we heard about radio wave sickness? Well, that's because microwave sickness was first reported in Germany, and here's all of the symptoms. And this was removed because when the Rockefellers took over the medical system, this stuff was removed. So when you think about the technology and what you're getting and what you're being sold and the things that come with it, if these symptoms are things that are happening to you, this is radio wave sickness. And you should just look at these and sit there and go, dizziness. I have dizziness all the time. Well, if I hardwire my internet, I can get rid of that because what's happening is all your cells are being pinged the entire time. And in order for people to know how safe all of this technology is, because I think that's an important one, this is the safety test. This is a plastic dummy with a telephone. They put the telephone up to the plastic dummy, and this is how they tell you that the technology is safe. So when you're using any of your devices, you can use airplane mode or turn off the data, but be aware that if you're placing these devices up against your body, you're the test dummy. Then we move into the whole pandemic, 2020 versus radio wave sickness. These are just some symptoms that you can kind of just check out and look at and see very similar similarities, just like the 1919 Kansas flu, very similar. And then we move into your blood on Wi-Fi. So people are aware of this is what's happening with the blood. You notice that that blood is very, very thick. And then you notice that the blood without the Wi-Fi, very not thick. It's all clotting together. The oxygen begins to decrease and then people can't breathe. And here's just a map that I made back in 2021. And if you notice, this was all the 5G technology right here. This was the start of it. April 20 is the beginning of it all. And then as 2021 rolled out, all this purple right here, if you go through all this, that's where it started to go. It magically started popping up while everybody was locked in their homes. So something to think about. And there's a book, The Invisible Rainbow, on this. There's the book, The Contagion Myth, which is a great one on this. There's a whole bunch of books that have been burned on this topic. And even Bob Beck's work with electricity and EMF is an important one to look into. So as we move forward, now we're going to move into frequency and some flight, because this is pretty cool. This is a blimp from 1783. People flying around at 1783, which kind of blew my mind when I was thinking about it. Then you go into the Tesla earthquake machine. People always wondering about earthquakes. Frequency, it's just and look where it was displayed. At the World Fair. They always show this technology, but then it always vanishes and appears in somewhere else. Next, we go into bells. I've talked a lot about bells. Bells going missing after World War II. All of these bells being destroyed because if you see that frequency that comes off of them, very healing, changes the structure of the body and also begins to heal the cells and everything around it. Also works on storms too. Speaking of storms, we got cloudbusters, which is something people should look into. Wilhelm Reich's work on this, all the stuff they're doing in the skies. There's a counter. Hook up a cloudbuster, connect it to water. You got yourself a counter. Then we move into cloudbusters with Wilhelm Reich, and this is him just chilling right here. And this is cloudbuster, cleaning up the skies. And then this is water with frequency. So people can kind of take all this in with what water can do. You take some water. This is Veda Austin's work. And you take something like, for example, the scissors, put it on top of the water, go to freeze the water. And then that's what it turns into. So when they say that the frequencies or cell phones are safe and whatever else, you got to think about that. This is really cool. My friend sent me this. She actually made this. This is an antenna, mercury cell harmonizer, frequency and energy storage. This just kind of breaks down those antennas. And I've done a lot of experiments with mercury. When you spin it, you create voltage. So these buildings are much more intricate than just a bunch of buildings running around. And this I thought was interesting too, because this relates. It's the stadium from the electric tower. Electric tower. Here's the tower. And we just showed a tower that creates that energy. So, and this is Buffalo, New York. It's an interesting stadium. All those stadiums, what they've been turned into is for entertainment purposes. They've been rebranded. Then we go into water. Just once again, we're back into frequency. Thought this was really cool because you kind of get to see frequency in its full form, how the beauty of nature and what comes from it. Then we move into electroculture, which I've talked about what happens with copper and brass and all these beautiful things. And this is a 9 pound sweet potato. So we can use frequency can be used to harm or frequency can be used to heal. And it can be used to grow a lot of food, but that's another topic, which we'll do another. Crop circles, same thing. Mother Earth, cymatics, frequency, everything, just communicating amongst each other. Very, very cool. If anybody's not looking into this, even though they debunk them, you should look into them. This I thought was very interesting because when we think about frequency, well, this is a little person right here, and these are giants. So what was the frequency of the Earth at one time that these people were this large, or what were they tapping into? And to take it a step further with frequency of food, I mean, those are massive. So something has changed on our realm, and I think the Rockefeller electricity has a lot to do with it. But certain places, it's still thriving like no other. Then we go into things about things missing. I think this is a really interesting one. This is New York City. And you notice that that Statue of Liberty is not there, but that looks like there's an entrance right here into the earth. It's a star fort. This is just something to think about because I have photos from this same exact period and there are no people in the streets. So the question is it a staged photo and where are all the people? This is an interesting one, Grand Canyon. Now, we all know the Grand Canyon as a copper mine, or maybe it's a copper mine, but we also know it as this beauty. But look there's buildings. And where are those buildings now? And who used to live on this? And what was this, a part of a castle? Now, as we tap more into frequency, we can look into the work of Herman Clausen. He did everything with atmospheric energy, which is really cool, sending blimps and balloons up into the air and capturing that energy. That's what the Eiffel Tower is for. And this is another version of the Eiffel Tower, so people can see really cool stuff to look into all his work. Then we move into John Keeley with the ether motors. I think this is really cool. John Keeley had a motor which could be turned on with the mind. So think about how cool that is. You turn it on with the mind, and then they're going to try to sell that to you probably in 2025, but this was already in 1893. So the technology's not new, that's for sure. Nothing's new under the sun. This one I thought was really cool. This was here in Phoenix, actually, Arizona. Electricity taken from the air drives automobile. 1921. Why are we paying for gas? Why do we have electric vehicles that have 200 miles to the charge when an electric vehicle in 1901 could get you 1,000 miles to the charge? Something to kind of think about. Nathan B. Stubblefield created the first Earth telephone. He also created an Earth battery. So the Earth telephone worked by what you would do is you would sink it into the Earth, you'd place it into the Earth with some copper, and then once you would see his little antenna right there, you could call your friends and family through the Earth. He also created an Earth battery in which would gain charges over time just based on the Earth energy. And he said, we don't need any of the electricity that we use. So this is one man that every person should look into, and he is one of the best probably out there. And very few people speak his name. Tesla definitely was around at that same time, but Nathan B. Stubblefield doesn't get enough credit, that's for sure. And this is his little Earth telephone, so you guys can kind of see it. Fascinating when you think about how you could power everything through the Earth. So what are we doing? And then we have Viktor Grebennikov, super cool, awesome information. He was doing work with beetles and levitation. So when we think about frequency and levitation, flying around, this is what he was discovering. You could take beetle wings, put it all together in this combination using fractals and different arrangements, and you'd get a charge. You could get enough charge, you could actually levitate. So his work is very interesting. And a lot of these people, like I said, we don't learn about it because after the 1920s, you know, Rockefeller started deleting a lot of books, burning a lot of books, removing a lot of information. And then this was also taking place in Russia. So then you think about the war, you know, between America and Russia and everything else and that situation. So a lot of the information was not exchanged between the two. This I thought was really interesting because when you think about these buildings that we were talking about in the beginning, this is something to kind of think about of what it used to look like. Over time, now I'm going back, I don't know what year these things were built, but when you go back in time, you start to look at these pictures, you start to sit there and think, wow, the castle is missing a lot of pieces. And through wars and wars and wars of people taking over and hijacking these buildings, pieces of these buildings have all gone away, such as this outer layer and all of this other stuff that looks like it's missing. So I've started to realize that the farther we go back, these buildings have already been here. Every castle and all the things you've seen, they were already here. It's just different groups of people took them over at different times, and then this is what's left over. So if you see a castle or a fortress that's still here to this day, those are the remains of people just blowing them up and doing all kinds of weird stuff with them. And this I thought was really cool. This was also from that atlas we were talking about in the beginning. This is the Starfort formations. I mean, look at it. They knew exactly how to build this, and that's what I found really interesting with this German fellow's work. It just kind of blew my mind that they knew exactly the dimensions, everything, how big everything was, and you're sitting there thinking, was somebody out measuring all of this stuff? You know, who was getting the aerial views? Who was up in the sky? Who was seeing this from every angle? So it's kind of something interesting to think about. And then this is St. Louis and Chicago, the World Fairs. This is what the buildings look like. We're back to color again. And this is just showing you what was in the United States at one time. And then a lot of it, TNT came around. And then this is the solar panel electric car of 1912. I think this is important because when a lot of people are thinking, oh, we got new technology. Well, this was already out here. And this is already saying in 1899, it was already being displayed. But none of these things came to life until, you know, someone said they needed to. So it made me realize that technology is much older than it seems. This I thought was interesting. This is like a Ferris wheel, but this was also, it says the gyro electric destroyer, which is interesting. They always pick like a name to kind of make these things look, you know, silly and whatever. Now we're on to cannons, which I think is interesting. This one says no using gunpowder. It's electric. So then you're starting to sit there and think, okay, well, what, 1500s, they had electric cannons? That really kind of changes the narrative. And the other thing too about moving cannons, imagine moving all this stuff around. Like imagine how challenging it would be, even if it's on wheels and it's on a wagon and you're pulling it around. It doesn't seem too efficient when you think about it. This I thought was interesting. This is a weather vane. That is massive. Look at that. Enormous weather vane made of wrought copper and all gold leaf on a church in Illinois. Churches with weather vanes. So something to kind of think about. Why would a church have this on top of it? Especially a conductive material, you know, something to kind of think about with that. This is also interesting. This is from Montauk Chai in his work, or Chi, Montauk Chi, and his work, and he showed that churches and temples extend to the sky to capture the universal force and channel it down throughout. So that was in the beginning. We were talking about all the antennas. And here we go again. So we're starting to see this theme of what's replicating nature and what's taking in this ether, the ether or the etheric forces or cosmic forces or chi, prana, life force, orgone, all of these things. And then as we move this way, got a couple more in here for you guys. But then we go into the whole Lord Electric Wind Indicator. So then we go into this one, and this is a weather vane. But it's interesting because it has different names. And this is why I like to look back at these books and see these different names and look at things and go, Lord Electric Wind Indicator. So you're saying that wind is producing electricity, which is fascinating. And you see a lot of windmills in the past. And during the World Fairs, they had lots and lots of windmills. So then you have to start to sit there and think somebody was tapping into this energy. Now, where was it all sitting is the question. Were there batteries underneath these buildings that people were having, like an earth battery? Because that's the part. We always see the top of the building, but we're never looking at the bottom below. So I think that's something interesting to kind of think about. This I thought was very fascinating. Homemade lightning. But you're going, Tesla coils. That's what that is. Tesla coils that are being set up in people's houses. And what's interesting is with Tesla coils, if this was present and these were large enough, it would actually cook all of this current technology that we have with the Rockefellers. Because all of this electric that we have now, it cannot sustain high static fields, which would be coming off of this. Actually, it would cook all the coils. So this is why a lot of Tesla's technology never came to light, because it competes so much with this, and then we wouldn't need all these wires. We wouldn't have to have all these hanging wires all over the place. So this I thought was really cool and just something to think about. Trevor James Constable is something for people to look into. We're talking about frequency, the ether, orgone, chi, all that. He's got a great book for people to look into, and that's tapping back into Wilhelm Reich. These are some cloudbusters. This goes back into frequency, everything with frequency and the weather. And then we have more different variations in which people can set up in their house to counter all the weather modification that takes place. I mean, that's pretty much what this stuff is for. It's really cool when you think about it. Moving to bells, I mean, 500, 1,000 pound bell. Imagine that ringing. I mean, just 2 tuning forks alone has to be pretty crazy. And to cast this and make this, carry this, move this, yeah. Once again, that's why I say question everything. Then you're looking over here, we're going back to Egypt, and those look like, once again, little power plants or little devices and antennas that we talked about in the beginning. Even the Ankh, same exact thing. These are also derived from copper, which is highly conductive. This I thought was really interesting. I had a friend send me this, and this was her 5-year-old showing antennas that were tapping into electricity. So it's interesting that 5-year-olds know before the third eye is calcified and it's all locked up, and they're not thinking like that anymore. This was going back into 1794. They were inflating balloons with hydrogen. So this goes back into thinking about how people were just flying around during this American Civil War, it says right at the top right there, just flying around in blimps. So that really gives you a different perspective than people on land and boats. And then that makes you wonder what the technology really was. Then we hit here, right here on a beautiful, this is a roller coaster of 1894, but that looks like an Eiffel Tower. And if you notice at the top of that has a brass ball, which would collect the ether, like we talked about in the beginning of this with the, and picking up on that energy. And you look at that design and see and go, wow, somebody just decided to build this in 1894 to entertain people. You start to really think more than just entertainment. And as we finalize out this one, we go into uranium glass. This is just another one for people to look into related to frequency, the radioactive properties that they tell people to stay away from, which I think is really interesting. And also you have depression glass, which, you know, what an interesting phrase coming from 1929 when you had the bankers orchestrate the depression. People started making all this kinds of glass, and they were using uranium, radium, manganese, and all these materials, and they were embedding it into glass. So when you think about a lightning bug and you think about your health, then you have to think about these are the properties in which you're drinking to enhance your health. And it's interesting because they came out with the story on the radium girls to scare people into staying away from all of these things and whatever it may be. But then you have to sit there and think, well, then if it's as dangerous as it is, why are there all these glasses, cups, bowls, utensils, silverware, everything else? So, you know, today's live and today's videos were just to kind of go through a little slideshow. I don't know if you guys like this type of format or whatever else, but I just figured I would try it out for the first time. Put up a real video, go through some things, just kind of unveil my thoughts, and you just let me know. Let me know what you think about this, and I plan on doing some more videos and actually full-length videos like this as well, but just some different things, and I can go through photos and videos and just talk about it and just discuss it and have a great conversation and discuss the past of a lot of things which have been hidden from us. But I hope you enjoyed the video. I wish you all a great Sunday and have a happy full moon.